Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wise the Dome TV. Today, I have a very, very special guest. I have an amazing scholar, author, professor. Um, Latest book, Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States. Dr. CBS, thank you for coming through. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
No problem, no problem. And so I kind of want to get into well, before we actually do that, like what kind of inspired you to tackle this topic, Black Scare, Red Scare? Just because like I said off camera, I think you are definitely tackling subjects that a lot of people aren't really touching, and these works are important, especially within the Black radical tradition. And so, what made you write this book?
Well, so part of my dissertation looked at the intersections of anti-communism, anti-radicalism, and anti-Blackness. So way back, finished in 2016. So I guess I started that research maybe 2012, 2013.
Mm,
But honestly, the foundational question I was asking initially was, why are there no critical political economists in Black studies? And so that just opened up several areas of inquiry. And so as I was doing research, archival research and secondary research, I just found that there seemed to be a connection between US state hostility toward Black people and an aversion to radicalism, specifically economic redistribution. And that became codified through communism at a particular historical moment, namely after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. And so I continued to follow that line of inquiry in the book, but use the terminology Black Scare, Red Scare. And the term Black Scare, scholars like Bobby Hill and Gerald Horne had used that terminology in some of their work. And then, of course, Red Scare is like a more commonly known term. And so I was interested in not only looking at how the Red Scare influenced the Black Scare, that is to say, the construction of Black people as a specter of destabilization, but also how the Black Scare was really foundational to the Red Scare, that is to say, turning those who challenge the US state apparatus, especially sort of social economic hierarchy, into enemies of the state. And so that's sort of the basis of the book.
indeed, indeed. In the book, in the beginning of the book, it might even be in the introduction. You speak about witch words and how they were used as a technique of repression in U.S. capitalist racist society. Could you elaborate on the use of witch words then and now in a contemporary sense? Because when I was reading that, and I know, Du Bois is the one that first wrote about it, but whenever I was reading that, I couldn't help but think about. I was watching. I don't know. Might have been one of those corporate media news channels, and during the student solidarity protest with Palestine, I noticed this thing of outside agitators and things to make it seem like these students weren't actually doing the knowledge on their own, and they had to have some type of influence. And also, whenever we look at this political climate, every year, you have things like CRT that uh, becomes a witch word, DEI, just all these things that rile up white nationalist bases, um, even when they don't necessarily know what they mean. I've heard people be called Marxists who aren't really offering any type of class analysis, but they're talking about Black issues. And so if you can just speak about the idea of which words historically and now.
Yeah, so which words, so we kind of use the terminology, I would say dog whistle today,
Hmm.
but I think that which words is a step above that because it's not only signaling to a particular base, but it's also it has a transformative kind of spell binding power, hence like which word. And so you Du Bois talks about how in the days of enslavement, the witch word was abolitionist. And this, basically turned somebody into a character that wanted to kill kindly slave masters and impose social equality between whites and enslaved Africans. And so these persons were to be lynched and mobbed. And then he said the witch word today is communist.
Mm,
Anybody who believes in civil rights, basically an economic redistribution, and any sort of challenge to the war machine, then they're considered to be a scoundrel and somebody who should not be able to work in this country, somebody who should be thrown in jail. And so, which words are these sort of shorthands that do the work of discrediting, of criminalizing, of marginalizing, and of actually distorting whatever it is that whoever is being targeted is doing. So in your example of the student encampments that were happening earlier this year, and in some ways are still ongoing, anti-Semitism really was the witch word. And
mm,
so automatically by calling something anti-Semitic, it means everything and nothing, right? So the actual denotation of the word is evacuated, and then it comes to stand in for anything that is undesirable and dangerous and ostensibly foreign inspired or inspired by outside agitators. And so you call something anti-Semitic, whether it's a protest or the encampments or a professor's position. So we saw, like, for example, Dr. Jody Dean and Dr. Russell Rickford and a bunch of other people being targeted. You call them anti-Semitic in order to discredit outright whatever it is that they're saying, and to automatically make whatever causes they're advocating or whatever activism or organizing they're engaging in like criminal or anathema to the state or to the institution. And so anti-Semitism is operating in much the same way that the term communist or nigger lover at a particular historical moment operated, right?
hmm hmm Yeah, and I think you just kind of alluded to it as well. Those, like, there's real implications behind it. Not just targeting an idea, but targeting people. And you mentioned a lot, within this book, different people that were demonized and made to be seen as un-American because either they're black radical or their class analysis. I kind of want to get into some of the theoretical foundations of some of the terms in the book because this, like, the whenever you mention the structural location of blackness, I felt like that idea is a profound idea and understanding, and it will be something that lasts in academia for a while. And so, if you can explain to the people who haven't read it yet, what the structural location of blackness is and what that means.
Yeah, interestingly, somebody just sent me a Facebook message today saying that they didn't understand what it meant. And so basically, part of what I was trying to work out is like, what is the materiality of blackness? Like, what is it as a particular type of relationship in the context of capitalist racist society? So it's not just race. It's not about biology or customs and attitudes. It's not just class, even though there is a intra-racial class relationship as well as a broader class relationship because it's a function of capitalism. And it's not caste. And so elsewhere I have castigated the use of caste to describe capitalist racist or racial capitalist society because it's not the case.
Right.
And so structural location of blackness was meant to describe a relationship to the mode of production, but also a set of social relations and political relations that create what I call an aporia. Aporia is an irresolvable contradiction. So the aporia is value minus worth. So on the one hand, Black people are absolutely essential and instrumental to techniques of accumulation in the context of the United States beyond the labor theory of value. So it's not just exploitation. It's not just a labor relationship. There's also expropriation. And so an example of expropriation is charging exorbitant rents
Mm,
for dilapidated conditions. So that's not a labor relationship, but it's a form of expropriation. It's a
mhm.
form of value extraction. So Black people are essential in that way, but then they're made to seem worthless. And so that valence of worthlessness is meant to obfuscate. It's meant to distort that value of Black people. And so I talk in the book, Hubert Harrison talks about in the context of enslavement that generally speaking, when you value something, you care for it more. But the contradiction or the opposite is true for Black people, that the more you brutalize it to extract more value. And so that's really where that aporia is derived. And so the structural location of Blackness is a material relationship, but it also is constituted by a set of like discursive and social practices that not only reduce Black people to a subordinated position, but then legitimate that subordinated position through saying, for example, like Black people are criminals, they ain't got no daddy,
Right.
like, you know what I mean?
Right.
They're lewd and lascivious, they're matriarchal, all those types of things that's meant to legitimate and to actually obfuscate the real reason why it is that Black people are in a subordinated position.
Indeed, indeed. And you mentioned, caste, the caste theory, or you know, analyzing our plight just through a lens of caste. I spoke with Dr. Penderhughes about internal colonialism and why simply viewing our situation through the lens of race is inadequate. Um, you know, they don't like Black people. That's what we're going through. That's it, right? In your words, can you speak about why just viewing things through caste and through our situation here in America, well, even all over the world, viewing our plight through caste theory is not an adequate analysis?
Well, so there are actual caste systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
Caste systems don't necessitate, number one, an economic relationship, and number two, a system of capitalist exploitation. And so in this piece I wrote called Caste Does Not Explain Race, it came out in the Boston Review. I used Sheikh Anta Diop and
Mm,
how he talks about a caste system in West Africa. And what he said was that, for example, relations of exploitation did not take place between superordinates and subordinates in a caste system in West Africa. That if, in fact, like if you were richer, you would be shunned and ridiculed if you exploited somebody who was in a lower caste than you,
mm,
right? Because these are not your equals. And so you're just seen as kind of taking advantage.
right.
Whereas the taking advantage of and extracting surplus value from subordinates is precisely how capitalism works. And so um, a caste system has particular mores and characteristics that don't apply. Number one, that don't necessarily apply to a racial capitalist system, but also there's characteristics of a racial capitalist system that are not necessitated in a caste system. And
Mm,
often, and so the use of caste is nothing new. So it dates really back to the 1890s, if not before. And there was like a particular caste school of race relations, specifically in the first half of the 20th century. And Oliver Cromwell Cox actually disproved this caste theory. And oftentimes, when caste starts to rise up as a descriptor, it's usually to evade a rigorous analysis of economic relations.
mm,
And
mm.
so that is my primary contention among many with the latest iteration of caste. But interestingly, so I'm gonna have to write some type of book or something about this because a lot of scholars, so like people like Hubert Harrison and W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells do use the term caste, but it's not consistent in terms of the way that they use it. And so
Mm,
this is, I think that when they say caste, they mean racial capitalism
mhm.
because it means so many different things. And it just becomes a shorthand for talking about the convergence of racial oppression and economic domination. So anyway, I don't know if that answered your question,
No,
but
yeah, absolutely, you did, you did. One of the other concepts that I kind of wanted you to go over is Wall Street imperialism, because
Mhm.
there's something I want to ask you something else about it, but I want the people who haven't read the book, who may not be familiar with that term or understand what it means, can you go through what Wall Street imperialism is?
Yeah, so essentially, Wall Street imperialism is a relationship between public and private actors for the purpose of expropriation domestically and abroad. What's there's two things I think that are important about Wall Street imperialism. One is that it is an internal relationship and an external relationship. And so part of what I talk about is the relationship between the US North and South as an imperial relationship that similar to the ways you see Great Britain exploiting like Nigeria, for example,
Hmm.
is akin to the ways that the US North exploited the US South. And what's the second part that's central to that internal relationship is that the so-called Negro question or Black people are sort of central to that relationship because it is Black people or the treatment of Black people that sort of kept wages low, that kept the South in a so-called semi-feudal state that hindered industrialization and development. And so it's Black people and Black labor, as well as Black subjection, that's central to understanding that relationship. Um, just as it's important to understanding the genocide and expropriation of Native Americans, to understanding the other side of the internal logic of U.S. or Wall Street imperialism. Monopoly is also another important aspect of Wall
Mm,
Street imperialism. So the rise of monopoly capitalism, which is effectively basically the only form of capitalism after the 19th century that the US has experienced, right?
hmm.
That petty capitalism really never was a dominant mode in this society. And so um, it was important for me to point out imperialism because oftentimes the US is construed as not an imperialist power because it doesn't have ostensibly doesn't have formal colonies. Now, if we look at Puerto Rico and Hawaii and Guam, et
Guam, yeah.
cetera, we
Mm.
do see that the US does have colonies, but it's not understood in the same way as sort of Great Britain or France or other imperial powers. But the US is absolutely imperialist. It's a imperialist power in free fall now, but it's important to point out imperialism as an important relationship because also you talked about internal colonialism. Imperialism is the structuring relationship. And so I don't talk about internal colonialism per se, but I talk about the Black Belt thesis, and I do talk about self-determination. And
Hmm.
that's a sort of precursor to what came to be known as internal colonialism and internal neocolonialism later on, especially as articulated through the RNA, because they are really influenced by Harry Haywood, from my understanding. And so, but part of what's argued is that Black people's oppression is national in character because of the imperial relationship or because of the imperial character of racist domination. And so that's another reason why it's important to understand that Black people are a sort of colonized or imperialized people, not just subjected to like discrimination and exclusion.
Right, right, right. Absolutely. And when it comes to Wall Street imperialism, you have a chapter where you're talking about Wall Street imperialism in Haiti and Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And um, it's one of my favorite chapters because it highlights something important, and it gives us an internationalist view of what's going on as African people. Um, can you kind of go into a little bit of Wall Street imperialism in Haiti and Africa? And also, I kind of wanted to ask you, whenever we look at what we know as Haiti, um, it being the it be defeating France and winning its own independence from the yoke of slavery. And then we know what happened after that. There was, France, United States, other nations began to interfere with their way of life, begin to tax them, begin to, have a military presence there. Also, they, use them for cheap labor to build empires elsewhere. Um, is it a thing to where even in 2024, Haiti, it can never be seen as it can never be in the eyes of the West, it can never be prosperous because of the history of Haiti and the inspiration that Africans got from it historically and still get from it to this day.
So to your latter question, um, I would describe it slightly differently
Mm-hmm.
as a dialectical or historical materialist. I think that because Haiti continues to be such a lucrative place to exploit,
Mm,
and a protracted target of exploitation, that this is the reason why Haiti cannot be allowed to prosper, and part of the reason why it's been the focus of such intense and ongoing extraction, expropriation, exploitation, etc., is because of it is the land of the blacks, right? And not
mm-hmm.
only that, a place that had the audacity to sort of free itself from enslavement, so self-emancipation. But it's not just, I wouldn't make it, I would just argue it out in materialist terms. So it's
Yeah,
not just
I understand.
because Black people have this idea about Haiti, it's because it actually has material value.
Mm-hmm.
And connecting that to the question about Wall Street imperialism abroad. So part of what I argue is that the treatment of Black people in the South was basically wholly transported to Haiti between 1915 and 1934 when the US was occupying it. And
Mm-hmm.
so there was a set of class relations dominant in Haiti at the time that was basically mapped onto color, right? But that they flattened that whole class dynamic, and they all were just niggas basically, right?
Right,
And so they would humiliate the petty bourgeoisie, the political class, and treat all basically all Black folks the same, except for the tiny sort of comprador class that they needed to have to allow for the occupation to function. And they brutalized Black folks there. Um, impressed unfree labor. So like the Caicos, for example, who were an unfree labor supply that also rose up. And so we're absolutely brutalized by the United States, specifically the Marines. And I read about Liberia and Ethiopia primarily through the writings of George Padmore and William Matthias Hunton. And essentially in Liberia, what happened was the United States basically turned Liberia into another colony, a colony for extraction, primarily through the interests of Firestone. So once
mm-hmm.
Great Britain had left and they found that, the rubber plantations were no longer of value to them, Firestone comes in to exploit those resources. And it's here that I start to talk about Marcus Garvey and why Marcus Garvey proved to be um, so dangerous to the state, because of course he was trying to repatriate African folks to Liberia, and this came up against the interests of Firestone. And initially, the Liberian um, political class was on board with the UNIA and on board with the colonial scheme that Marcus Garvey and UNIA had come up with. But as they got drawn into the Western orbit and began to become, to orient themselves as a comprador class, they no longer, they basically criminalized the presence of the UNIA. They began to align with the United States. They began to support forms of slavery to recruit labor for the Firestone plantation. And so it's the same types of relations that were happening in the rest of Africa by people, by powers like France and Great Britain. So, exploitation, the conscription of land, imposition of unfreedom on African folks. And so those are just two examples that I gave as to how the internal imperialism that was happening in the United States was sort of cast abroad through some of the same actors. And
Mm-hmm.
then also those ideas, those values then came back to the mainland. And so imperialism is something that's happening out there and here simultaneously.
Yeah, and in the book you also talk about um the genres of blackness and the West Indian, seen as uh, uh, I want to say uh, alien anarchists, right? And we know obviously how powerful the UNIA and Marcus Garvey movement was back then. You in the book you mentioned the conflation of Garveyism and Bolshevism in the 20s. I thought that was very interesting because that's again that's an analysis that you don't see often, but it's very important. Can you speak about that? Because you know we know about we know Garvey and some anti-communist stances that he had, but you speak about how being seen as a radical black man or radical black woman or a communist kind of put you in the same boat with the US government.
Yeah, so basically, so for example, Garvey's advocacy of Black self-determination dovetail with the support for Black self-determination by Communist Party. And in fact, I should say that in the other way, that basically the Communist Party got its line of Black self-determination through its failure to recruit Black UNIA folks to the Communist Party. But this pushing of self-determination, anti-imperialism, some anti-Euro-American imperialism that was espoused by both the UNIA and the Communist Party, the emphasis on workers. So there were these similarities in ideas that allow for people like J. Edgar Hoover to say, oh, well, the UNIA is a communist plot, right? And of course, it's racist because, again, it's this idea that Black people can't have independent, like endogenous thought.
Right.
And irrespective of what they say, right? So Garvey can say he's not a communist or he's anti-communist all he wants, but that doesn't stop the fact that his constituency, which is, you know, quote unquote, ignorant masses, these alien West Indians, from being under the influence of Bolshevism, right? It doesn't stop his organization from being infiltrated by communists or people with communist leanings. And of course, and again, they connect these ideas. And so later on, this is called parallelism. So part of the way that the anti-communist dragnet worked specifically during the Cold War was by drawing parallels. So if a communist organization or a so-called communist front advocated for civil rights, for example, and the NAACP advocates for civil rights, the NAACP could be red baited as like a communist front or communist adjacent or overrun by communists. And so it's a similar pattern that's happening very early on. Mm-hmm. Especially because J. Edgar Hoover saw Black people and radicals as like the biggest threats to the American way of life. And of course, you know, the UNIA was the largest organization, largest movement of Black people then and now. And so it became a similar type of threat. So, and it was important to lift up Garvey in that way to show the dragnet of anti-communism and to show the ways how it is that the Black Scare and the Red Scare could work together, even if you know, Black folks are anti-communist. So I talk about Garvey, but I also talk about Ben Fletcher and A. Philip Randolph, both of who were red baited, both of who were punished by the US state, even though in their own, they had a sort of what we might call a left-wing anti-communism. Ben Fletcher as like a syndicalist, and then A. Philip Randolph as a socialist. And so it wasn't the sort of top-down anti-communism, but even as they espoused suspicion or disdain toward the Communist Party, and it, in some ways even celebrated, you know, the repression of the Communist Party, that didn't save them. And so that's the point, is that, you know, anti-communism doesn't save us because it's too entwined with anti-Blackness. It's too entwined with this fear about Black social equality.
Right, right. In the book, you mentioned domestic workers, uh, and you know how that was a job reserved for Black folks, right? Black women. And even then, you know, when times got rough and when white women needed those jobs, like Black women had to, you know, move to the back. Did you watch the I don't even want to call it a debate, but that the Trump and Biden circus the other day.
The debacle. I did not.
Yeah,
No, I don't
yeah.
believe in wasting my time. I have a newborn. I
I,
do not waste my
I
time.
feel you.
So
I feel you. I feel you. And but I know you probably saw the clip of the Black Jobs thing, right? And I see a lot of people, in my opinion, kind of give like some reactionary type of thoughts about it. But as someone, a scholar such as yourself, someone also that you know knows our history, has a class analysis. Um, Whenever you hear this mention of black jobs, right, and you know, not even just that, I've read several reports that stated black workers were overrepresented in low wage roles, even to this day, right, in 2024. But this whole idea of black jobs, like from your perspective, what's the analysis on it? What is he saying? What is he really saying?
basically, he's saying so-called low-skilled service-based work that is arduous, undesirable, and that's meant for undesirable
Hmm.
people, right? It's the
Hmm.
jobs that historically white people were able to transcend once women, and specifically white women. So white men were able to transcend once white women, and then black workers were integrated particular types of industries. And so, for example, laundries were Negro work
Hmm.
because it was Negro women's work in particular, because it's extremely difficult, extremely dangerous work. Um, Firemen on trains at one point was black folks work, but once that was deemed to be skilled work, that got taken over by particular white ethnic groups. And so interestingly, barbers used to be primarily black people, but again, especially at the turn of the 20th century, there was this idea that black people should have no monopoly on skilled work,
Hmm.
which is why I think in particular ways I'm not Booker T. Washington had important things to say with respect to black people having essential skills and particular types of skills that we used to have a monopoly on, and then one generation later we did not, right? Which then reduced black people to things like sharecropping and other types of labor that can easily be deemed redundant. That's the other aspect of black jobs, right? Jobs that can be deemed redundant, um, and therefore prone to what is it? Not only redundancy, but just to obsolescence, basically. So yeah, that's what they meant by black jobs. But interestingly, entertainment's a black job. But that's more of a like the high skilled service work, if you will.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah.
You know, the it doesn't. I mean, it's not lost on me that a lot of these jobs that they are calling low skilled, low skilled workers, they were calling essential jobs during the pandemic, right? Like it's so hypocritical. We live in a place where people can work 40 hours a week, work hard, right, and still not enough money to pay their rent and take care of their families. um Whenever we even just it's again somebody that has a class analysis, like whenever we see like where this nation is going as far as everything being so expensive these days. Um you see the CEOs making 300 times their employees. uh where does that end, right? Like what's the end game for this type of capitalism and imperialism?
What you named, when I remember I talked about that aporia value minus worth. That value minus worth is precisely what you named in terms of the essential jobs being the
Hmm.
jobs that are uh some of the worst paid, right? Some of the worst working conditions, whether it be longest hours or just terrible working conditions. And again, they tend to be jobs that are filled by racialized people and women. But in terms of what is the end game, some people say fascism,
Hmm.
some people say revolution. Um, it
Absolutely.
really,
That's
uh,
the only thing, right? Like, I mean, because it's going to continue to get to the point where, I mean, people are eventually are going to have to rise up because it's just going to become unbearable for people that may not even be used to seeing things that way. You know what I mean? Like Black folks, we've historically in this country have been at the bottom of any type of racial hierarchy. But this capitalism, it doesn't work for white people either.
right, which is why uh fascism. And interestingly, it is actually the white petty bourgeoisie that is sort of the most prone
Hmm.
to fascism, so the white small capitalists, because they're the ones who see their conditions deteriorate most starkly.
Hmm.
But so, you know, there's nothing inevitable about fascism. There's nothing inevitable about revolution because um it depends on the rate of oppression, because you heard that story that like basically if you put a frog in water and you
Hmm.
just turn the heat up gradually over time, it doesn't jump out because it's used to
Right.
that.
Right.
It becomes inured to it in a particular way. And so I think that likewise, number one, as a society, all Americans think they're middle class and none of them are. It's like you're closer to living in your car than owning your home,
Right.
actually.
Right.
Um, Secondly, it's just a massive entertainment industry. And so people are very entertained and not very educated. And I think that we're the most highly propagandized nation in the world. So the dog whistles or the witch words are very effective.
Hmm.
Then you got all these fringe beliefs by, yeah, I love our people, but our people got some too.
Man, you
So
you already know.
and so there's nothing inevitable about either outcome,
Hmm.
but it's just the fascists in waiting are much better organized and have a monopoly on things like media, in ways that the left or that Black radical folks do not. So and historically, liberalism is much more amenable to fascism than to any type of communism or socialism, not
Right.
least because of white supremacy.
Right.
So, yeah, that's the end game.
No, I think that's a powerful point. Like one, it's neither are inevitable. Especially revolution. That's something that we obviously have to, we have to continue to educate ourselves, educate our people. It doesn't happen on its own. It kind of reminds me. I wanted to ask you on this, still on this question of labor. Um, we what, it kind of just read it's interesting because I was reading this book while that circus came on, right? um but the thing, I guess the thing that just struck me is this idea that immigrants are taking our jobs, being espoused by Black folks now, that I'm starting to see. Not all, obviously, but there are movements within our community that are, using this rhetoric, and they're forming like a anti-immigration stance. Um, I know you've seen it. Like, what are your thoughts on like this new wave of, not again, not all, but some Black folks who are, pushing this anti-immigration thing?
Interestingly, Booker T. Washington was anti-immigration.
Mm,
So he has, he talks about precisely for the reasons I was talking about earlier in terms of like monopoly on skills. And, basically what he was saying to white folks is like, us.
Right.
You know us, white folks. You don't know them random white foreigners. Like, us. We raise children. Like, like rock with us. Just, we ain't gonna try to date your women. Just let us get this land, get
Yeah.
this money, and like
But it's
we'll be
funny that
faithful
you
to
say
you.
that because that's what a lot of them sound like now.
Right. And so there's a sort of long, I think, history of um jingoism, nativism, xenophobia. And I think so there's a couple reasons for it. One is that some people take that American and African American very seriously, right?
Hmm.
They believe that the only issue with the United States is that it's racist and that this is happenstance, right? That this
Right.
is a malformation, not a actual endemic feature.
Hmm.
And so if that's the case, then it's like everything, the US is worth salvaging if we could just get rid of this racism thing.
Right.
And so, that also puts African Americans in a particular in like a kind of special position because not only are we Americans, but we're also the enlightened ones, so to speak, right? We're the ones that's going to save America from itself. Then I think, um, the FBA, Foundational Black American, and ADO stuff, it reminds me a lot of a debate or a discourse that was happening in Black studies in like the 1990s. There's a book called Dude, Where's My Black Studies, in fact,
Mm.
that had the same type of argument where like, you know, Black African Americans in particular, but Black folks struggled hard for Black studies, even paved the way for like ethnic studies and women's studies. But then when you started to look at the constitution of the makeup of these Black studies programs, there was a lot of African and Caribbean, both faculty and students, to the detriment of African American
Mm.
students. So African Americans were not benefiting from the hard struggle. And it wasn't just that, it's then the relations between African Americans and African and Caribbean folks were somewhat contentious because some of these, immigrant populations would come in with the American dream and have very pejorative things to
Hmm.
say about Black African Americans or very negative perspectives. And so that's sort of what the ADOS thinks. So when I hear about like tethers and this type of
Yeah.
thing, like that's sort of what it reminds me of. And I'm a Pan-Africanist, and so I don't
Same.
agree with that perspective. But as somebody who loves Black people and who takes seriously um even the goofy shit, I think it's important to understand like where that comes from. We're also in like a post-truth era, and so there's people who believe that they're not African,
That's
they're
yeah.
Moors, I guess.
Or Native
Some are
American.
Moors,
Yeah.
some are Native
Hmm.
Americans, um
Some are Hebrews.
some are Hebrew, so anything but African,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
um And social media can exacerbate these different types of positions because then you have like the diaspora wars,
Right.
right? So, but all of this, in my perspective, is a failure of the left because we
Hmm.
haven't won over, because a lot of these people are working class people. There's ordinary Black people.
Yeah.
And so we haven't done our job to win over um regular Black people to the position of a Black communist or socialist position, right? And
Hmm.
I say Black communist or socialist because I'm not, I'm a Rodneyist, right? So
Hmm.
I'm a I am a Marxist, but from the Black world.
Right.
And so that's our fault. That's our failure. That's our organizational weakness. That's our lack of sort of political humility, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have to do a better job of making like revolution inevitable, right? Um, and more desirable than some of these reactionary trends that we see.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. It's disheartening sometimes though, just to see African people want to be anything but African. And I mean, we know what the root is, you know what I mean? And it's just like to buy into this American dream, to this that has never worked for anybody except for, the ruling class. Um, it's, you know, even with the idea of reparations, we are definitely obviously owed, you know, at the same time, reparations is not uh it's not liberating us, right? It's it's I mean, we'll get a check, but we'll still be living within the confines of this wilderness that is what I call it, right? And I don't know. I think whenever we look at ourselves and look at our culture, I think whenever we talk about revolution and we talk about the world that we want to see, it's hard for me to see that without people understanding and embracing the fact that they are African people, right? Like, um, you can scroll down YouTube now, and what we have in the quote unquote conscious community is you might see somebody speaking something real, and then you might see somebody talking about we are the people of the lost city of Atlantis or something, right? And it because this is stuff that I see, right? And but how do we make this type of information, you know, uh, how do we make that like because it's easy to a lot of people enjoy the esoteric stuff, the things that you probably can't really prove. But when we start talking about our material conditions, real history, how do we get the people to, begin to gravitate towards that?
Yeah,
Because sensationalism is at an all-time high right now.
yeah, edutainment. I mean, I think that, I've been thinking a lot about adult literacy and like teaching adult literacy. And so I'm trying to look for some like workshops on how to teach adult literacy because like we can't read. And it's not
Hmm.
just Black people. It's like there's a huge population in this country that's functionally illiterate. Like people can read words on pages, but
Right.
there's no we but that it's functional illiteracy. Like you can't comprehend, there's no reading comprehension, and there's no media literacy, and so which means that people just believe every single thing they hear. And so you've had Jared Ball on, I'm sure he talked
Hmm.
about this. And so um I think we've always been creative because for part of our history we were barred from reading, and yet people
Right.
still learned and people still were able to nurture communities and engage in resistance and build homes and et cetera. And so I think that we need to be, I do think literacy is important,
Hmm.
but we also have to be creative in how we put together information. And I think we can't be scared of Black people,
Right. Right.
like we petty bourgeois folks, whatever, especially because part of the win, if you want to call it, of like the civil rights movement was economic stratification. And so historically, all Black people living together, there was a particular type of responsibility. But now that you don't, you can really be Black and probably not be around, even though you're like two people removed from poverty, you can like
Hmm.
live your life so you're not really around for
Hmm.
Black people per
Right.
se, right?
Right.
So there's not that same level of responsibility. There's a, capitalist ethics where so much of it is about number one, believing like this Black entrepreneurship thing,
Hmm.
or so-called Black capitalism,
Hmm.
when Black people own no means of production, but that's neither here nor there.
Right.
But or this idea of like getting out, so if you do get some money, it's like you buy your mom a house and you get out of wherever it is that you come from. So there's not a lot of um community responsibility, except
Hmm.
in times of crisis, right? So we
Hmm.
saw some of that come out like in COVID, for example. And
Hmm.
so we have to make, collective ethics, collective forms of care is something that we do in our everyday life and not just in times of necessity, although we're in generalized times of necessity now for a number of reasons. And so I think that, you know, I talk about ethics, epistemology, and politics, but the ethical part is really, really important because how we relate to ourselves, like how we relate to each other, are we alienated or are we sort of connected and collective in our approach? I think that that goes a long way. And the reparations piece too is often argued on in sort of like individualist type of logic, like everybody, each family or individual gets their thing. And I don't know that there's a sort of collective or community understanding. Now, I don't want to speak too forcefully on that because I haven't studied
Same.
extensively like the reparations
Yeah.
movement. And, there's a difference between like in Cobra, for
Hmm.
example, and a Queen Mother Moore's
Hmm.
position on reparations and like probably ADOS, FBA, whatever.
Yeah.
But I do think that we have to, the way that we understand the world or epistemology, right? We have to have a reorientation. We have to have a reorientation in terms of how ethics, right? How do we relate to ourselves? How we relate to each other? And then of course our politics, like, voting for one of these dusty white men or the handkerchief heads they have as their henchmen,
Hmm.
that's not gonna save us, right? That's not even close. And so I think that understanding what the political means and having an expansive notion of the political is really, really foundational because
Yeah.
it's not getting better.
No, no, and like you mentioned, one of the things that we often see in, I would say, the more corporate side of Black media, and media in general, is this idea: if we don't vote for Joe Biden, Donald Trump's going to get in and run amok, and it's like this fear mongering type of thing, right? But it's never whenever whenever they talk about Biden's record and the genocides that he's responsible for, or played a part in, um, it people get accused of spreading misinformation. I saw Jared and Diallo and Geechee show the other day where they had a brother on, um, and I think from Brother from Africa Streams, and they listed him and a lot of other Black media people to say, hey, it's a spreading misinformation about Joe Biden, and you're going to help usher in one of the worst presidents we ever had. Um, as somebody who ain't scared, right? Like whenever you hear that kind of stuff, like this whole idea, like we gotta get Joe Biden in because Donald Trump's going to get in office, run amok, and things are, you know, uh, the apocalypse is coming, right? Like, what are your thoughts? Because that's what corporate media on in the center is doing. It's a fear mongering. Hey, forget any type of genocide. Forget the 94 crime bill, forget any of this, his comments on Zionism and all of these things, forget all of that. We just can't get Trump in office.
You know, I think so there's like this discourse right now about I think there was maybe some poll that was saying it couldn't have been there's no way it was accurate, but it was saying like some large number of Black men were going to vote for Trump. It was something like 60%.
Nah, that's crazy.
Okay. And even I was like, okay, number one, don't think that's true. But number two, even if that were the case, right? There's this whole discourse about, Black women keep saving democracy.
Yeah, I see it. Yep.
What does it mean to save a democracy that reduces us to butchered half lives?
Mm,
To use the term of George Jackson, that's supposed to be some win. That's
right.
supposed to be some good thing. When you have Stacey Abrams kissing that old dusty motherfucker's hand, you got Billy Porter bowing to him like
Yeah,
a
he kissed his hand
fucking
too.
idiot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So excuse me, Stacey. Let me not
Okay.
slander. Stacey
Okay.
Abrams just bowed.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Billy Porter kissed his hand. Yeah.
that's supposed to be some prize. Like,
Right.
and so I think that we cannot be politically unserious, right? I don't think it's correct to say like Biden and Trump are the same, but they don't have to be the same for Biden to be doing precisely the things that had people up in arms under Trump. So I remember hearing a lot of kids in cages talk, a lot of border talk when Trump was president, where Biden has effectively militarized the border,
Yep.
um, put into place a draconian law that wasn't even, I don't think it was even in place under Trump, where like if border crossings exceed 2,500, everybody gets deported back, like to Mexico.
Mm.
2,500 crossings a day. And so, Biden completely played in everybody's faces with, with funding the police. There's a cop city in every single state except, I always get it wrong, I think it's North Dakota, like
Mm.
some cop city either in construction or already there. And of course, we know so many of these police departments train with the IDF.
Yep.
On top of the genocide in Gaza, genocide in Sudan, genocide in Congo, reoccupation and colonization of Haiti. And this is all under Biden.
Right. Right.
And so we're supposed to think like, so people are like, vote for Trump to stop what's already happening now.
Mm.
And I get it. Okay. Trump wants to defund the Department of Education. That would be, that would be different. Biden was supposed to forgive student loans.
Yeah. Right. What happened to that?
That did not happen. And so, it's, as they say, it's sort of, six on one hand, half a dozen on the other.
Hmm.
And I think that this sort of rabid, um, kind of histrionic emphasis on voting for Biden or we're gonna die points to our lack of organizing.
What do you
We're
think?
just not organized.
No, you're right. You're right. What do you think about the type of campaigns though that the Democratic Party like targets us with, like the take your booty to the polls and all of that? Like it's so condescending. Like it's like, yo, you can't be serious, and people people really be going for it too. Like
Like the nigga McNuggets.
yeah, come on, man.
It's actually, it just goes to show, I think, like the again, value minus worth. It's like
Mm,
they need your vote,
yeah.
but they find you to be worthless. So they do things like carry hot sauce in their bag, or you remember when
Hmm.
Biden berated all them old black motherfuckers on that
Yep.
call,
Yep.
tell them if they didn't vote for him, they're not
Mm,
black.
yep. I
That,
remember that.
and so
Mm.
it's complete. So it's complete disrespect. And until we are serious about, I think, self-determination and being able to care for ourselves and being serious about improving our lives, through any means, right?
Mhm.
Through voting, through armed self-defense, through grassroots organizing, and anything in between. Until we're actually serious about that and able to convey that, I don't know that any party is going to be, is going to actually value Black people. Plus, the constituency of both parties hates Black people and hates
Facts.
working people,
Facts.
and that's the reality. Is it rich people hating Black people, or is it, these white, backward white folks who voted for Trump,
Mhm.
millions upon millions of whom voted for Trump in the last election? Is it them?
Right.
Right. And so, again, until we are serious about things like self-determination, self-defense, dual power, and a different understanding of the political beyond electoralism, I just, we're gonna be having these dumb debate and have people like stupid Joyanne Reed talking about she'll vote for Biden even if he's in a coma. And it's like,
Yeah, I
what does
saw
that
that.
even actually mean?
It's crazy. You know, it kind you kind of made me think of something. This is the last thing I want to ask you. Again, first off, appreciate you for coming through and spending time on the show. One of my friends who's a professor in Africana studies, you mentioned you know armed resistance, and Dr. Gerald Horn's new book. I forgot the name of it. I just ordered it too.
Armed struggle, question mark?
Yeah, yeah, armed struggle, right? And so um he me and him had a conversation about the state of Africana studies at this point. And he talked about how um books even like Black Scare, Red Scare, Gerald Horn's new books, are books that talk about armed resistance, books that theorize armed resistance, like these kind of things. He, from what he told me, he said he feels like they're being shunned a lot in Black academia. Um, as somebody who is in academia, somebody who's an author, somebody who is, in my opinion, one of our leading scholars. Like, is that something that you've noticed as well?
Yeah, I feel like I quote this in every interview, but Walter Rodney basically said that Black academics are enemies of the people until proven
Hmm,
otherwise. Um, and our jobs are to be like guerrilla intellectuals, right?
right,
Guerrilla scholars to wage struggle where we are, which means doing work that matters, among other things. It means doing work that matters to people. But I do think that there's a lot of work that's done. I really do believe the Black petty bourgeoisie, of which Black academics, um, to which Black academics belong. Like, I think that there is this belief in like democracy and U.S. democracy and the U.S. project, and even if that belief is like a criticism, like that that ultimately is meant to promote like DEI or whatever,
hmm,
more whatever more ascriptive categories in certain high places. um and I do think, people fundamentally believe that, and so that's what their scholarship reflects. And like, they're not in community, they're not in organizations, they have no relationship to movement, so why would they think otherwise? And any radical scholarship they might do is just an object of inquiry. They don't really share those politics, and they don't think that we could win.
right.
And so why would they produce anything else? And um people really care, I think, about being influential. They care about being, having resources, having money. And they care about you know, being the I guess being the most privileged prisoner,
Hmm,
for lack of a better term. And that is what it is,
yeah,
and it's actually quite, that is not what our historical task is. We have a responsibility as academics to do a particular type of work. But I think most people see it as like a privilege as opposed to a responsibility. And so, and people are lazy.
hmm.
Like, doing the bare min and are cowards.
Hmm.
There's nothing worse than a lazy coward. So,
And whenever you think about how Black studies was even formed, right? We think about, what happened at Cornell and things of that nature. Like, how far off from there do you think Black studies is at this point?
it's very far off. And I know, I wrote in my another aspect of my dissertation was about culturalism.
Hmm.
And so culturalism is not the study of culture, but it's the abstraction of a study of culture from any consideration of our historical, material, and structural conditions. And I think that really, and I offered a critique of culturalism in Black studies in particular. And so, a lot of people are doing like this pop culture studies or doing particular types of quote unquote, like certain types of feminism that is just ideology, right? Anyway, so doing, Afro pessimism, so doing particular types of work that ultimately do not reflect like a responsibility to people. And that's not all like Black
Yeah,
feminist scholarship, but
yeah.
it's some of it.
Hmm.
And so, that is not what the struggle for Black studies was, but there was a endemic contradiction in that, because you're struggling to be part of an institution whose function is class reproduction,
Mm, right.
right? And so the redistributive and sort of democratizing logic of the Black studies movement, I think, was always going to come up against that sort of professionalization and institutionalization. And especially when, you know, some of the most effective organizers were people who did not have degrees, and those people got pushed out. um it was inevitable that Black studies was going to look the way that it looked. And then
Right.
it's, especially with the, you know, the rise of like post-structuralism, postmodernism, and the sort of identitarian turn, this is what you get. And the problem is then these people are training generations of other people. And
Yeah.
so it's a hot mess.
Yeah. Indeed, indeed. Well, we appreciate you and everything that you do. Again, definitely one of my favorite scholars. This book is one of the most important books of last year. I would say this and Tip of the Spear.
Tip of
Um,
the spear, read it.
yeah, you
Yeah,
got to.
that's the book. Yeah.
And so again, we appreciate you and your contributions to just our thought, and our understanding of history and theory, and keep fighting the good fight. Dr. CBS, has been an honor.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Peace.